One of the best voices from whom to learn about how to look at that entire transformation is a former law professor of mine. We're very excited to have him here. Dr. John McGinnis's original field at Northwestern University School of Law was constitutional law. But 2 years ago, when he published Accelerating Democracy, he also joined the growing field of futurists who believe that data technology does not just improve transparency. Data technology can improve our democracy itself by changing the way that government and the people relate to each other. I'm excited to invite you to join me in welcoming Professor John McGinnis.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here because I think my remarks will show that I think your work in promoting data transparency speaks to one of the fundamental issues of our time and is really essential to make our democracy work and to safeguard our future. The reason that data transparency is so important is because of the rate of our technological acceleration. And so let me just say a word about that. I don't think it's a surprise to people that the exponential growth in computation is the most important fact of our time, generating all sorts of transformations in society. Now, many of these transformations are quite amazing. Really, if I had been told of them when I was a young boy, I would have thought they were science fiction. The idea that all knowledge is only a click away on the internet already. In the next decade that we will likely have self-driving cars. These are dramatic changes and boons for humanity. On the other hand, that same rate of technological acceleration creates certain kinds of threats as well. New forms of technology that need to perhaps to be regulated. More generally, possibilities of social disruption. Think of a self-driving car, for instance. When we have self-driving cars and self-driving trucks, there are 3 million people in this nation who drive for a living. Now, of course, I'm not a Luddite. There are not a finite number of jobs, but that suggests that there will be a lot of disruption and transition. And that means we need a better, smarter, more thoughtful government. And that's really, I think, where, in the larger scheme of things, that data transparency comes in. Because we really can't have sensible debates about social policy unless we can measure the effects of those policies. And without data transparency, we're not going to be able to use the tools that modern technology gives us to evaluate social policy. And so I want to talk a bit about that. And this really is about really what's going on in the academy and how that connects to the important work that you're doing. The most important transformation of the social sciences and policy analysis in the academy is the rise of empiricism, of data analysis. And that makes a lot of sense because with the ability of computers to crunch a lot of data and the ability for us to find a lot of data, at least if it's made transparent, as your coalition is trying to do, suddenly we can just not have theories about how programs work. We can actually have hard facts, hard discipline on how we understand what are the outputs of policy. One way of thinking about this is if you were thinking of hiring someone at a law school 50 years ago and trying to decide between hiring a theorist or an empiricist, someone who's skilled in looking at data, it wouldn't have made a lot of sense to hire an empiricist. After all, 50 years ago, it took essentially a summer to run one regression analysis. But today, that's completely different. Empiricist has become wildly more valuable than an empiricist, partly because of the rise in computation and partly because of your own good work. When I'm in a workshop at my own law school in real time, people are, when an empiricist presents, taking down data sets themselves and using them to challenge the empiricist's conclusion. And because of that, many of my colleagues, now I would say a plurality of my colleagues, are themselves empiricists. And this isn't just a fact about Northwestern University, it's a fact going right across law schools. It's not just a fact about law schools, it's a fact about the social sciences generally. Almost all the recent winners of the John Bates Award, which is the award given to economists, best economists under 40, have been empiricists. And that shows the power of this method. So one of the ways we can actually use your work is to have government to be even a better platform to use the data you're generating. And let me just say a few words about that before ending on discussing of how I think this can make a better politics for us all. This data analysis is going to work best if we have platforms that allow us to test various kinds of policies against one another. So one of those ways is federalism, or more generally, decentralization, allowing different jurisdictions to have different kinds of social policies, allows, when we have transparent data, for empiricists to come in and try to decide what policies have what effect. Difference, actually, is more useful than ever before in social policy because we can measure that difference. This is sort of interesting because, as Hudson Hollister suggested, I began my career as a constitutional law professor, and central to the United States Constitution is federalism. One might have thought that was some relic of states' rights, but understanding the importance of data and the possibility of its analysis in the modern world shows that federalism can be more relevant than ever, and the permission for states, at least within some scope, to go their own way can actually give us more information and make policy better over time. Another way of using the kind of data transparency that you're working on, together with computational capacity, is to create randomness, actually, in programs. The government can, if it's unsure of which kind of policy is going to be better, for instance, some kind of educational policy, they can randomize that policy, and if they have really very good transparent data about the results, then actually have essentially a kind of natural experiment on which policy is better. The government has already used that in some welfare programs, and I think that's likely to be another ability for people to use it in the future. This should be happening at all levels of government. Congress should build that into their laws. Agencies should think of ways of decentralization and randomization to make maximum use of data to test policy. And that is, I think, the hope for the use of this data. And let me just make a point too, insofar as government has better platforms to make the analysis of data useful for policy analysis, there'll be even a greater demand for transparency. And so there's a kind of chicken and egg. The better the analysis, the greater the demand for transparent data. The more transparent the data, the greater the demand for empiricism. So there's a kind of virtuous circle in which I think you're engaged and in which I think you can benefit from actually the empirical side. So let me end, and I'd be delighted to take your questions, try to put this in even a broader perspective about why your work on data transparency is so important. As it's often remarked today that our politics is extremely partisan. But data transparency and its analysis, I think, gives us some hope that we can transcend partisanship. Because after all, most people, at least in our modern democracy, they want similar objectives. People want better schools for their children. but they're often bitterly divided, sometimes because of interest, some kinds of ideology, about the claims of what are going to make better schools. Is it better more spending on schools? Are charter schools going to make the outputs of education better? When we actually test that, we lower the temperature of democracy and transform an ideological dispute into a dispute actually about what actually is going to work. And that lowers the temperature of the democracy. And also, I think it should make people more humble because it might turn out that their preferred idea doesn't work as well as another idea. We're not going to find that out unless we have the data, the transparent data, to measure different effects. Indeed, the final way I think I would put your work in perspective is insofar as the facts become more transparent, that's good for making us behave, for understanding what we have in common. What we have in common is just not our personal beliefs, our intuitions. The facts of the world are what we have in common. Often the difficulty with them is those facts really aren't transparent. And data transparency at bottom is trying to make the facts of policy more transparent to the world. And that's going to have a feedback effect, I think, into our politics, a feedback effect into making people more humble, more evidence-based, and more sympathetic to learning from others. So thank you very much.
I think we have the opportunity to take a couple of questions, so let me call for those. If you're thinking of a question, you're not going to hold back.
Okay, see what?
Hi, I'm Helena Sims. I work for AGA, the Association of Government Accountants. In terms of the common ground issue, I've had that conversation with other people here today. How do you get to a situation where somebody convenes the people that can work toward that common ground? So often things are so partisan, it's hard to get there. I guess we have the National Academy of Public Administration and other organizations that might be able to do that. But in general, when you're looking at public policy, who do you see as being a neutral convener?
Well, I think there's really my own view about the hope from data transparency and empiricism is not that we're going to get some neutral convener, as it were, but that the norms of public discourse will slowly change. That once we actually have persuasive data, that the people will expect more data-driven discussions. And so even if one can't trust any particular person, the whole structure will move to a more evidence-based focus. Because I don't think we can hope for some deus ex machina that is likely to be clothed with that everyone will agree that are neutral. I've not found that person, even in the academy. And so I think one has to think about the process by which we change our politics by changing what people demand from it. And that's, I think, one of the promises of a more transparent government.
We'll take one more question.
My name is Tim Rund, and the session before this was about the presidential transition. I'm just curious, there's been amazing movement made in a positive direction around data transparency. What's the biggest danger? I mean, what is the potential that takes something like this off the rails? What is the biggest thing that we face in terms of slowing this down?
Okay, I think there are two matters that are one matter I think is the greatest concern, and I'm not an expert on it, but I think it is a concern, and I think that's privacy. The question of how to make data anonymous, because it's very useful, but on the other hand, and we actually need often data that relates to people. After all, policy is about people. If we don't have data that shows how, for instance, to watch how some education program affected people over the course of their career, that will be impoverished with respect to data. On the other hand, people might understandably not be eager to share that data with others. And so how to make that anonymous and how to make it not susceptible to hacks by either private people or the Chinese government, I think that is a real concern. Now, I think that probably can be conquered. I mean, we can temper that concern with some forms of encryption, some kinds of permission for certain empiricists who are credible, and if they were to leak the data would hurt their reputation so much. So I think that can be addressed, but if I were to see that, I would see that as the greatest threat, because I think that could create a movement, a popular movement, against a more data and evidence-based politics. Otherwise, I think that movement, could be a strong one, particularly as people understand it, particularly as people see that policies that are evidence-based achieve things, and I think that can create the demand. What most concerns me is something that would stop that demand, and that's privacy concerns.